November 9th, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The dawn came late to these woods, filtered through a canopy so dense that even midday felt like dusk. Corporal Thomas Mitchell crouched in a foxhole that smelled of wet earth and rotting pine needles, his breath visible in the frigid air. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough to numb fingers but not cold enough to freeze the mud that clung to everything. Around him, the forest stretched in every direction, a primeval darkness of Douglas firs and oak trees that had stood for centuries, now transformed into a killing ground where every shadow might conceal an enemy position. The sound of distant artillery rolled through the trees like approaching thunder, a constant reminder that death here came in many forms. Mitchell adjusted his position carefully, mindful that any sudden movement might draw attention, and brought his rifle to his shoulder. The weapon was a standard-issue M1000 903 Springfield, a bolt-action rifle that had served American forces since before the First World War. But the scope mounted atop it was anything but standard. The modification looked, even to Mitchell's eyes, like something salvaged from a junkyard. It had begun its existence as a pair of German binoculars, taken from a dead Wehrmacht officer during the push through France. One lens had been shattered by the same bullet that killed its owner, rendering the binoculars useless for their intended purpose. Most soldiers would have discarded them. Mitchell, however, had seen potential in the remaining optic. Using wire stripped from a destroyed German communications line, electrical tape acquired through careful trading, and a mounting bracket fashioned from scrap aluminum by a sympathetic machinist in the motor pool, he had created a telescopic sight. The magnification was inconsistent. The crosshairs, etched onto a piece of plexiglass with a diamond scribe, weren't perfectly centered. The entire assembly shifted slightly when the rifle was moved quickly. By every technical standard, it was inadequate. By the unforgiving standards of the United States Army Ordnance Department, it was completely unacceptable. Staff Sergeant William Cordell, the battalion's designated marksmanship instructor, had made his opinion abundantly clear 3 weeks earlier, during a rare inspection behind the lines. Mitchell remembered the moment with crystalline clarity. Cordell had picked up the rifle, examined the improvised scope with undisguised contempt, and delivered his verdict in front of a dozen other soldiers. "This is garbage, Corporal. Garbage that'll get you killed and maybe get the men around you killed too. You want to play sniper, you need proper equipment. This trash stays off my range." The humiliation had burned, made worse by the laughter that followed from soldiers who saw Mitchell as presumptuous, a corporal who thought he knew better than the Army's procurement experts. When Mitchell had filed a formal requisition for a factory-made telescopic sight, specifically requesting the M73 scope that was standard issue for designated marksmen, the request had been denied within 48 hours. High Command, stretched thin across multiple fronts, wasn't wasting resources on non-essential modifications. The Army had designated marksmen in each unit. Mitchell wasn't one of them. His improvised scope would not be replaced with proper equipment. The message was clear. Use your rifle as issued, or face disciplinary action for unauthorized modifications. But Mitchell hadn't removed the scope. He had simply become more careful about when and where he used it. The truth was that his improvised optic, for all its obvious flaws, worked. In the 3 weeks since Cordell's condemnation, Mitchell had used it to eliminate 17 German soldiers, each shot carefully documented in a small notebook he kept wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the omnipresent moisture. 17 men who would otherwise have killed American soldiers. 17 threats neutralized from distances where iron sights became inadequate. The other men in his squad had noticed, even if the officers hadn't. They no longer laughed at the scope. They asked him to watch their flanks during patrols. They trusted him to spot German positions before those positions could open fire. And now, on this particular November morning, with German forces consolidating their positions after weeks of brutal fighting, Mitchell's improvised optic was about to prove its value in a way that would reverberate far beyond a single foxhole in a German forest. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest had become a meat grinder. American forces, attempting to advance toward the Ruhr River dams, found themselves trapped in terrain that negated every advantage they possessed. Armor was useless in the dense woods. Artillery, normally decisive, could only clear small pockets before the Germans reoccupied positions. Air superiority meant nothing beneath the thick canopy. The forest itself seemed to fight alongside the Germans, concealing machine gun nests, camouflaging minefields, reducing visibility to mere yards. Casualties had been staggering. Entire companies had been reduced to platoon strength. Fresh replacements arrived weekly, only to be killed or wounded within days. The soldiers called it the death factory, the meat grinder, the green hell. Officers spoke in optimistic terms about strategic objectives and acceptable losses, but the men doing the dying knew the truth. They were being fed into a battle of attrition where every yard of ground cost dozens of lives, and those lives bought nothing but more forest that looked exactly like the forest behind them. The German defenders understood their advantage perfectly. They had transformed the forest into a fortress, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. They had positioned their forces with the skill born of desperate necessity, knowing that losing this ground meant exposing the German homeland to invasion. And they had placed their command elements with what they believed was complete security, well behind the forward defensive lines, in positions they considered safe from American small arms fire. This calculation, reasonable by every conventional military standard, was about to prove fatally wrong. Mitchell had first spotted the German command post 2 days earlier during a reconnaissance patrol. The location was approximately 800 yards behind German lines, situated in a small clearing that had probably been a forester's station before the war. The building itself was unremarkable, a single-story structure with a pitched roof designed to shed snow. But the activity around it told a different story. Officers came and went with purposeful urgency. Radio antennas protruded from the roof, barely visible against the sky but unmistakable to trained eyes. A motorcycle courier arrived every few hours with dispatch cases. Most tellingly, a guard rotation of at least 6 men maintained constant security, far more than would be assigned to protect a simple supply depot or aid station. Mitchell had reported the position through proper channels, recommending it as a target for artillery. The response had been predictable. Artillery ammunition was too precious to waste on uncertain targets. Airstrikes were impossible under the canopy. A direct infantry assault would cost too many lives for an objective of uncertain value. The command post, if that's what it was, would be left alone unless it became an immediate threat. Standard military logic, impossible to argue against. Except that Mitchell, studying the position through his improvised scope, had begun to understand that this wasn't just a command post. It was the command post, the nerve center coordinating German resistance in this entire sector. Over the next 48 hours, Mitchell had conducted what amounted to a detailed intelligence analysis from his foxhole. He watched the patterns. He noted which officers received deference from others. He observed the timing of courier arrivals and departures. He correlated those timings with German artillery strikes and troop movements that his own unit experienced. The picture that emerged was unmistakable. The building housed a battalion-level command structure, possibly regimental. The senior officers coordinating the German defense spent hours in that clearing, protected by distance and forest, believing themselves beyond the reach of American infantry weapons. They were coordinating the very resistance that was bleeding Mitchell's division white, making decisions that sent young German soldiers to their deaths while remaining safely distant from the consequences of those decisions. And they were doing it at a range that Mitchell, with his improvised scope, could reach. The decision to act had not been easy. Mitchell understood that what he was contemplating fell into a grey area of military discipline. He had reported the target. His superiors had declined to engage it. Proceeding without orders could be construed as insubordination. But Mitchell had also watched too many friends die, cut down by German fire that seemed to anticipate American movements with uncanny precision. He had helped carry wounded men back through the forest, listening to their screams as makeshift stretchers jolted over rough ground. He had attended memorial services where chaplains spoke comforting words over graves that held men barely old enough to shave. And he had come to understand something that the officers in their relative safety behind the lines perhaps could not. That in this forest, in this particular moment, of this particular battle, orthodox military procedure was failing. The situation demanded improvisation, adaptation, individual initiative. It demanded exactly the kind of unauthorized, irregular action that peacetime armies punished but wartime armies survived on. November 9th dawned cold and grey, with low clouds that promised rain before nightfall. Mitchell had been in position since before dawn, having used the darkness to move forward from his unit's position into a spot that offered better sight lines to the German command post. The location he had chosen was technically in no man's land, that deadly space between opposing forces where movement during daylight invited immediate fire from both sides. But Mitchell had learned to move through the forest with a patience that bordered on meditation, advancing inches at a time, pausing for minutes between movements, becoming part of the landscape. His foxhole was barely large enough for one man, scraped into the earth beneath a fallen log that provided both concealment and a stable rest for his rifle. Pine branches, carefully arranged, broke up his silhouette. A camouflage net, liberated from a destroyed German position, covered his helmet. He had brought 6 canteens of water, cold rations for 3 days, and 100 rounds of ammunition. And he had brought his rifle with its mocked, improvised, supposedly useless scope. The German command post came alive shortly after dawn. Mitchell watched through his optic as guards changed shifts with mechanical precision. An hour later, the first senior officer arrived, driven in a Kubelwagen that navigated the forest trail with evident difficulty. 2 more officers followed on foot 15 minutes later. Then, at precisely 8:30 in the morning, the command vehicle arrived. It was a modified Opel Blitz truck, the canvas covering removed to reveal a mobile communications center bristling with radio equipment. From this vehicle emerged a German colonel, his rank evident even at 800 yards from the silver braiding on his uniform. The man was perhaps 50 years old, moving with the stiff formality of career military service. He carried a map case and was immediately surrounded by junior officers seeking his attention. This, Mitchell knew, was his primary target. Remove the colonel, and the German command structure in this sector would be decapitated. The shot would be extraordinarily difficult. 800 yards exceeded the effective range of the Springfield by several hundred yards, at least according to official specifications. At that distance, bullet drop became extreme, requiring Mitchell to aim several feet above his target. Wind, barely noticeable at ground level, would push the bullet sideways during its flight. The bullet itself, a standard 150-grain full metal jacket round, would be moving subsonic by the time it reached the target, reducing both accuracy and terminal effect. And the scope, that improvised assembly of salvaged optics and scrap metal, would magnify every tiny movement of Mitchell's body, every tremor of fatigue or cold, turning them into wild variations at the target. By every calculation, the shot was impossible, but Mitchell had made impossible shots before. He understood his equipment better than any factory engineer could. He knew that the scope's magnification, while inconsistent, was sufficient. He knew that the crosshairs, though imperfect, gave him a precise aiming reference. He knew the trajectory of his rifle's bullets with the certainty born of hundreds of practice shots. And he knew, with absolute conviction, that the German colonel in his sights had sent men to kill Americans, and that removing him would save American lives. Mitchell settled into his shooting position with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that this moment would define everything that followed. The rifle butt seated firmly into his shoulder, spreading recoil across his upper body, rather than concentrating it at a single point. His left hand gripped the forestock with just enough pressure to steady the weapon without inducing tremor. His right hand found the small of the stock, finger resting along the trigger guard, not yet on the trigger itself. His breathing slowed, became regular, a meditation that excluded everything except the relationship between his body, his rifle, and the distant target. Through the scope, the German colonel was a small figure, magnified but distant, moving with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself safe. Mitchell watched him consult his map, point toward different sectors, issue orders that junior officers received with rigid attention. The human part of Mitchell, the part that had been raised to respect life and dignity, recognized this man as someone's father, someone's husband, a human being with hopes and fears and people who loved him. But the soldier part of Mitchell, forged in the crucible of the Hurtgen forest, saw only a target, a threat to be neutralized, an enemy commander whose death would save American lives. The wind had died to almost nothing, a rare moment of stillness in a forest where air currents were usually chaotic and unpredictable. Mitchell's breathing reached the bottom of an exhalation. His body achieved that moment of perfect stillness between breaths, when the human organism becomes briefly motionless. His finger moved from trigger guard to trigger, taking up the slack with infinite patience. The crosshairs, those imperfect lines scratched on salvaged plexiglass, settled on a point approximately 6 feet above the German colonel's head, compensating for the rainbow arc that gravity would impose on the bullet during its 2-second flight. And then, with a pressure so gradual that he could not identify the exact instant of release, Mitchell fired. The Springfield's recoil was a familiar friend, a sharp punch against his shoulder that signaled the beginning of the bullet's journey. The report, though loud to Mitchell's ears, was softened by the forest, absorbed by the trees, unlikely to reveal his position. Through the scope, blurred by recoil but still visible, Mitchell watched the bullet's impact. The German colonel had been gesturing toward a map, his right arm extended. Mitchell saw the man's body jerk violently, saw him collapse backward, saw the junior officers around him freeze in that moment of shock that precedes comprehension. The range and the scope's limitations prevented Mitchell from confirming the exact wound location, but the immediate collapse suggested a center mass hit, possibly chest or upper abdomen. The colonel was down, possibly dead, certainly out of action, and Mitchell, working the bolt with practiced efficiency, was already chambering his second round. The German response was predictable in its chaos. Junior officers rushed to their fallen commander. Guards scanned the perimeter but looked in wrong directions, expecting attack from ground level rather than from a distant elevated position. Someone shouted orders that Mitchell couldn't hear but could see in the animated gestures. This confusion, this moment of command paralysis, was exactly the window Mitchell had anticipated. He shifted his aim to a major who was attempting to organize the response, a man whose body language suggested authority and decisiveness. The second shot required the same careful process: breathing control, stillness, precise aim point calculation, gradual trigger pressure. The Springfield spoke again. 800 yards away, the German major stumbled, clutched his side, and went down. Not an instantly fatal hit, but sufficient to remove another leader from the equation. Now the Germans understood they were under fire from a distant position. Guards began returning fire, but their shots went wild, aimed at shadows and guesses. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The carefully organized command post dissolved into confusion, as men who moments before had been planning German operations now scrambled for cover. Mitchell, working with the methodical precision of a craftsman, continued his terrible work. A captain who tried to reach the radio truck, shot through the upper chest, down before he completed 3 steps. A lieutenant attempting to organize a defensive perimeter sent a mass hit that doubled him over. A senior sergeant, probably the battalion's operations chief, trying to gather scattered map cases, shot that sent him sprawling. Each shot required the same painstaking process. Each shot sent a bullet on a 2-second flight through space where 1,000 variables could push it off course. Each shot, impossibly, found its target. The improvised scope, that assembly of salvaged parts and field expedients that had been dismissed as garbage, was performing beyond any reasonable expectation. The magnification allowed Mitchell to distinguish individuals at a range where they would have been indistinct blurs to naked eyes. The crosshairs, despite their imperfection, provided a consistent aiming reference. The mounting, for all its apparent fragility, held 0 through repeated shots. Mitchell had unconsciously compensated for the scope's quirks and limitations, adjusting his hold and aim to account for its idiosyncrasies. The relationship between shooter, rifle, and optic had become intuitive, transcending the crude mechanics of the assembly. Mitchell didn't aim with the scope so much as he aimed through it, his mind integrating its information with his understanding of ballistics and wind and distance to create shots that should have been impossible. By 10 in the morning, the German command post had effectively ceased to function. Bodies lay scattered in the clearing. Wounded men had been dragged to cover. The survivors, mostly junior officers and enlisted men, showed no inclination to resume command activities in that exposed position. Mitchell, counting his remaining ammunition, estimated he had fired 23 shots. He had confirmed hits on at least 9 targets, possibly more. The actual death toll would remain unknown, but the operational impact was undeniable. German forces in this sector had lost their command structure in a single morning. The colonel who had been coordinating their defense was dead or dying. His senior staff were casualties. Their radio equipment, abandoned in the panicked withdrawal, would be captured by American forces within hours. The intelligence it contained would reveal German positions, supply routes, and operational plans. And all of this had been accomplished not by artillery, not by airstrikes, not by a squad-level assault, but by one man with a rifle they had called garbage. The implications rippled outward like concentric circles from a stone thrown in still water. German forces in adjacent sectors, receiving no communications from the disabled command post, began making decisions based on outdated information. Coordinated resistance began breaking down into isolated defensive actions. American units, probing German positions that afternoon, encountered less organized opposition. A German counterattack planned for that evening never materialized because the officers who would have coordinated it were dead. By nightfall, German forces were conducting a fighting withdrawal from positions they had held for weeks, not because they had been defeated in direct combat, but because their command and control had been shattered. The American advance that day gained more ground than had been taken in the previous 3 weeks combined. Soldiers who had been preparing for another day of brutal close-quarters fighting instead watched German forces retreating through the forest, abandoning prepared positions that should have been defended. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest would continue for weeks more, and would ultimately extract a terrible price from both sides. But on November 9th, in one sector of that vast battlefield, the tide had turned because of 50 cents worth of salvaged German optics and wire. Mitchell extracted himself from his position that night, moving with the same patience that had gotten him there. He returned to his unit to find that the sudden German withdrawal had already become common knowledge, though its cause remained a mystery to most. He filed a brief after-action report describing his activities, expecting either commendation or disciplinary action, possibly both. What he received instead was something more unexpected, careful attention from officers who had previously dismissed him. Within a week, his rifle and its improvised scope were photographed and documented by ordnance specialists. Engineers examined the mounting system, noting its stability despite crude construction. Optical specialists tested the German binocular lens, confirming that despite its improvised mounting, it provided adequate magnification and clarity. Ballistics experts reconstructed Mitchell's shots, calculating trajectories and wind effects, confirming that the claimed engagement distances were not only possible but likely. And somewhere in the chain of command, someone made a decision that would validate everything Mitchell had done. The army, for all its bureaucratic inertia, was capable of learning from field experience when that experience was sufficiently dramatic. The official designation that eventually emerged was Rifle, Caliber 30 M1903A4, Telescopic Sight M70 3B1, Field Modified. The designation was bureaucratically neutral, but the underlying reality was clear. The army was institutionalizing Mitchell's improvisation. Ordnance depots began receiving instructions to modify existing rifles using captured German optics when American-made scopes were unavailable. Armorers were trained in mounting techniques derived directly from Mitchell's improvised bracket design. The wire and electrical tape were replaced with machined components, but the fundamental concept remained unchanged. Adequate optics, securely mounted, could transform an ordinary rifle into an effective long-range precision weapon. By early December, the first officially modified rifles began reaching frontline units. By January, production had scaled to the point where modified rifles were being issued not just in Europe but in the Pacific theater as well. The eventual production numbers told their own story. 12,000 rifles would ultimately receive the M73B1 modification, a designation that concealed its origins in a corporal's field expedients. These rifles would see service through the end of the war and beyond, proving effective in roles from counter-sniper operations to observation post-security. The modification cost approximately $14 per rifle, compared to nearly $80 for factory-produced sniper rifles. The savings were substantial, but the true value lay in availability. American forces, chronically short of specialized equipment, suddenly found themselves with adequate numbers of precision rifles to assign them at company level, rather than hoarding them at battalion or regimental headquarters. The democratization of precision fire, as one historian later termed it, changed tactical calculations throughout the European theatre. German officers, accustomed to relative safety behind their lines, found themselves vulnerable at distances they had considered secure. Japanese commanders in the Pacific faced similar sudden mortality. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical casualties. Staff Sergeant William Cordell, the marksmanship instructor who had condemned Mitchell's scope as garbage, found himself assigned to train soldiers in the proper use of the M73B1 modification. The irony was not lost on him, and to his credit, he acknowledged it directly when he encountered Mitchell again in January 1945. The conversation was brief but meaningful. Cordell admitted that his initial assessment had been based on peacetime standards that didn't account for wartime necessity. He acknowledged that Mitchell's improvisation had likely saved lives, both directly through enemy casualties and indirectly by enabling the broader modifications. And he expressed something that sounded remarkably like respect for a corporal who had seen a problem, created a solution, and proven that solution under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. Mitchell, for his part, expressed no satisfaction in being proven right. He had lost too many friends in the Hurtgen forest to take pleasure in professional vindication, but he accepted Cordell's acknowledgement as what it was, an admission that warfare often demanded solutions that looked wrong by conventional standards, but proved right in application. The technical specifications of the M73B1 modification, when finally formalized, revealed how much of Mitchell's original improvisation survived into official production. The German binocular lens provided 4-power magnification, less than the 6-power of dedicated sniper scopes, but sufficient for engagements out to 600 yards. The mounting bracket, refined from Mitchell's aluminum scrap original, attached to the rifle's receiver using existing screw holes, requiring no permanent modification to the weapon. The crosshair assembly, upgraded from Mitchell's plexiglass scratch to precision-etched glass, maintained the same basic configuration he had created. Even the focus mechanism, which in Mitchell's version had been a friction-fit arrangement of washers and wire, retained that fundamental approach in its refined form. Engineers had essentially taken Mitchell's proof of concept and manufacturing optimized it without altering the core functionality. This was military procurement at its rare best, recognizing field innovation, validating it through testing, and scaling it to meet operational needs without destroying what made it effective. The human cost of the Hurtgen Forest battle continued long after Mitchell's November afternoon of precision fire. American casualties would eventually exceed 30,000, including nearly 9,000 killed. German casualties were comparable, perhaps higher. The forest itself was devastated, transformed from ancient woodland into blasted moonscape. Veterans would carry psychological scars for decades, nightmares of endless trees and sudden death. The strategic objectives that had supposedly justified the battle remained questionable even after victory was achieved. Some historians would later argue that the entire operation was a tragic mistake, a battle that should never have been fought. But within that larger tragedy, there were moments like Mitchell's, where individual initiative and improvised solutions achieved what orthodox methods could not. These moments didn't redeem the battle's futility, but they did demonstrate that even in the worst circumstances, human adaptability and creative problem-solving could make meaningful differences. The broader lesson, though not immediately recognized, was about the relationship between institutional knowledge and field innovation. The United States Army, like all large military organizations, relied on centralized procurement, standardized equipment, and established procedures. These systems existed for sound reasons. They ensured reliability, maintained interoperability, controlled costs, and provided accountability. But they also created inflexibility, particularly in the face of unexpected combat conditions. The gap between what peacetime planning anticipated and what wartime reality demanded often grew wide enough to endanger lives. Mitchell's improvised scope represented a bridge across that gap, created by a soldier who understood both the theoretical principles behind precision shooting and the practical constraints of combat operations. His willingness to deviate from standard procedure, accepting personal risk of disciplinary action, exemplified the kind of initiative that warfare often demanded but peacetime organizations struggled to encourage. The post-war analysis of the M73B1 modification program revealed interesting data about its effectiveness. Rifles equipped with the modification achieved first-round hit probabilities approximately 40% higher than unmodified rifles at ranges beyond 400 yards. This translated to significant tactical advantages in situations where precision fire could neutralize threats before they could respond. The modification also proved remarkably durable, with failure rates well below those of more complex factory-produced optics. The simplicity that had made Mitchell's original design look crude actually contributed to its reliability in field conditions. There were fewer components to break, fewer adjustments to drift out of alignment, fewer opportunities for moisture or dirt to degrade performance. The modification worked because it was straightforward enough that frontline soldiers could maintain it with minimal tools and training. Mitchell himself survived the war, returning to civilian life with a Bronze Star for valor that made no specific mention of his November actions but encompassed his overall service. He rarely spoke about the Hurtgen Forest and never publicly claimed credit for the scope modification that bore his indirect fingerprints. Like many combat veterans, he seemed to prefer letting his wartime experiences remain private. But soldiers who had served with him told stories, and those stories gradually acquired the embellishment and mythologization that accompany any remarkable military achievement. Some versions claimed Mitchell had killed 20 Germans with 20 shots. Others insisted he had eliminated an entire German general staff. The truth, less dramatic but more impressive, was that he had identified a tactical opportunity, created a tool adequate to exploit that opportunity, and executed a series of extremely difficult shots under combat conditions. The mythology obscured this reality, but the reality remained. Mitchell had seen what needed to be done, determined how to do it, and followed through despite institutional resistance. The German perspective on that November afternoon remains largely undocumented. Wehrmacht after-action reports from the Hurtgen Forest were often fragmentary, compiled under retreat conditions by officers struggling to maintain unit cohesion. But scattered references in recovered documents suggest that the German command understood they had lost senior leadership to what they termed Fernschütze, distant shooters. Some reports attributed the casualties to American sniper teams, assuming that multiple shooters had been involved. The possibility that a single soldier with an improvised weapon could inflict such damage seemed not to have occurred to them, perhaps because their own doctrine emphasized centralized control of precision weapons. The German army employed dedicated sniper units equipped with sophisticated optics, but these were specialist troops assigned to specific missions. The concept of ordinary infantrymen improvising long-range capability apparently fell outside their tactical framework. This blind spot, minor in itself, exemplified a larger pattern in the late-war Wehrmacht: increasing rigidity in the face of deteriorating circumstances, reliance on established procedures when adaptation was required. The M73B1 modification's service life extended well beyond World War II. Korean War archives contain references to modified M1903 rifles still in use by American forces, particularly in mountain warfare, where long-range precision fire retained tactical value. Some modifications appeared in Vietnam, used by specialized units operating in conditions where modern weapons proved less suitable. And even into the 1980s, some law enforcement agencies employed rifles that traced their lineage directly to Mitchell's improvisation, finding value in the simplicity and reliability of the basic concept. The design had achieved something rare in military equipment. It had identified and filled a genuine need so effectively that it remained relevant across multiple technological generations. While newer rifles and optics eventually superseded it, the fundamental principle survived, that adequate magnification, securely mounted and properly employed, could extend the effective range of infantry weapons far beyond their iron sight limitations. The officers who had initially laughed at Mitchell's scope faced an uncomfortable reckoning. Some, to their credit, acknowledged their error and adapted their thinking. Others clung to their original positions, arguing that Mitchell's success was an outlier that didn't justify broader doctrinal changes. But the evidence was difficult to dispute. The M73B1 modification worked. it saved lives. It achieved tactical results that alternative approaches failed to achieve. And it had originated not from engineering laboratories or procurement offices, but from a corporal's determination to solve a problem using available materials. The implication challenged comfortable assumptions about where innovation originated and how military organizations should respond to field initiatives. Some officers embraced this challenge, becoming advocates for bottom-up innovation and field-driven procurement. Others resisted, preferring the certainty of established hierarchies. This tension between institutional conservatism and adaptive flexibility would recur throughout military history, each generation learning and forgetting the lessons about who sees problems first and who develops solutions most effectively. November 9th, 1944, began as just another day in an apparently endless battle. It ended with German forces in retreat and American soldiers asking how a sector that had been impassable for weeks suddenly became penetrable. The answer, when it emerged, was simultaneously simple and complex. One man with a rifle they had mocked had eliminated an entire command structure. The simplicity lay in the basic mechanics of precision shooting. The complexity lay in everything that made those shots possible. Mitchell's skill, his improvised equipment, his tactical judgment, his willingness to act independently, and the target-rich environment created by German commanders' false sense of security. Remove any single element and the outcome changes. But all elements aligned in that forest clearing, creating a convergence of capability and opportunity that changed the course of a battle. The story of Mitchell's scope, properly understood, is not primarily about a clever modification or effective shooting. It is about the relationship between institutional systems and individual initiative, about the gap between what organizations plan for and what reality demands, about the courage required to deviate from procedure when procedure proves inadequate. Mitchell didn't set out to revolutionize army procurement or develop a new weapon system. He simply wanted to kill enemy soldiers more effectively, to protect his friends, to survive and help others survive in a forest that was consuming American lives at a horrifying rate. The scope was a tool toward that immediate goal. That it became something more, that it influenced procurement decisions and tactical doctrine, that it saved countless lives beyond the ones Mitchell personally engaged, was a consequence he likely never anticipated and certainly didn't seek. The final accounting of that November afternoon will remain forever incomplete. How many German soldiers died from Mitchell's shots? How many American lives were saved by the resulting command disruption? How many subsequent engagements were influenced by rifles modified according to principles Mitchell demonstrated? The numbers, even if precisely known, would fail to capture the full significance. What matters is that in a moment of institutional failure, when proper equipment was denied and makeshift solutions were condemned, a soldier created something that worked and proved through action that his critics were wrong. The 50-cent modification that changed battle outcomes stands as a monument to human adaptability, to the power of practical innovation, and to the importance of trusting soldiers to solve problems in ways that distant bureaucracies cannot anticipate. The officers who laughed had been wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in emphasis, but fundamentally wrong about what was possible and what constituted adequate equipment. Their laughter reflected not personal failing but institutional blind spots. The limitations of thinking that privileged official channels and formal procedures over field expedience and individual initiative. When Mitchell's scope proved effective beyond any reasonable expectation, those officers faced a choice: acknowledge their error and learn from it, or cling to their original positions and dismiss the evidence. The record suggests that most chose the former path. To their credit, they allowed their initial mockery to be overturned by results, accepted that a corporal had seen something they had missed, and supported the institutionalization of his innovation. This willingness to be proven wrong, to let field results override institutional prejudice, represents military adaptation at its best. The legacy endures not in monuments or official histories, but in the continued recognition that warfare demands flexibility, that good ideas can originate anywhere in the hierarchy, and that sometimes the most effective solutions look wrong until they're proven right. Mitchell's improvised scope, dismissed as garbage that would get him killed, instead killed the enemy and saved lives. The contrast between initial assessment and ultimate outcome could hardly be more stark. And while the specific technical details matter, the larger principle matters more, that in the terrible crucible of combat, practical effectiveness trumps bureaucratic approval, field innovation trumps institutional inertia, and a determined individual with clear vision can accomplish what large organizations with vast resources cannot. That lesson, like Mitchell's scope, has a way of remaining relevant long after the original circumstances have passed into history.